Sorry for the delay in starting, but a previous meeting went overtime. So I apologize for that. I'll call the meeting to order. With regard to attendance, we have regrets from Trustee Cook, and I'm not sure about student Trustee Sarim, but he may be here later. Approval of the agenda for public session, Trustee Leclerc, Trustee Sipcar, all those in support. That's carried, thank you. Motion to convene to private session, Trustee McKinley, Trustee Buckler, all those in support. That's carried, thank you. We're now recessed to public session, private session from public.
The education meeting for June. I'll call the meeting to order, and I will start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on land and surrounded by water, originally inhabited by Indigenous peoples who have traveled this area since time immemorial. This territory is within the lands honored by the Wampum Treaties, agreements between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenni, Lenape, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Specifically, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the Huron-Wendat peoples in the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture while remaining committed to moving forward respectfully with all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Moving on in our agenda to attendance, we have regrets from Trustee Hatfield and Trustee Cook, and none to my knowledge from Student Trustee Mohammed. So, approval of the agenda. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda? Trustee Nelson, second by Trustee Leclerc. Oh, yeah, sorry, with the amendment on our yellow sheet that we already have with the two speakers for the delegations. All in support of the agenda? Any opposed? Seeing none, thank you. Declaration of conflict of interest. Is there any conflicts of interest for this meeting? Seeing none, I'll move on to approval of the minutes. We have someone to move the minutes. Trustee Sipcar, second by Trustee Leclerc. All in support? Seeing no opposition, that moves. Business arising from the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move on to presentation. We actually will have one presentation with one of our reports later, but there's nothing actually in this spot at the moment. Delegations, we do have a couple of delegations. Our first delegation is Derek Bezo. Derek, would you like to go over to the mic? And you have up to 10 minutes. I just go by his name, by their name. Thank you for being here, Derek. There's a lot of switches up here. Yeah.
Let's try. Oh, it's hot. Mike's hot. Is my. Yeah. Good evening. Thank you so much. May I begin? Perfect. I do have speaking notes to keep myself on track, so I apologize if I'm staring down a little bit. I just want to make sure I don't lose track. I can digress for those who know me to infinitum. So thank you so much for having me here tonight to speak in before what will be the student census and recommendations report that we have coming to, and also from the analyzing of the data collected. I really want to state my appreciation to all those who supported this effort, and particularly to students and families who contributed. So my name is Derek Carl Bizzo. I use any and all pronouns. I'm here as someone who works with young people in a community setting. I'm associated with Trans Wellness Ontario, supporting their operations and education efforts, as well as Q-Link Windsor Essex, where I provide drop-in programming for teens and for young adults. As well as someone who had the opportunity to be involved with the census as a community stakeholder and as a member of the 2S LGBTQI+ community, as someone who uses words like gay, queer, and trans to describe myself. I first want to take a moment to also wish everyone a happy Pride Month and Indigenous History Month. Both are so important to celebrate and commemorate and are linked in so many ways. As we acknowledge the land, it's also important to acknowledge the history beyond dispossession and occupation of lands by colonial forces, but also the history of imposition of social norms, including gender and sexuality. As discussed in a recent guidebook, Intersections, Indigenous, and 2S LGBTQI+ Identity, and a self-paced education module titled Restoring the Circle that was developed by the Native Women's Association of Canada, the authors discuss how gender and sexual variance were actually the norms for many Indigenous communities prior to contact, and pre-contact Indigenous communities did not regulate sexuality as Christian colonizers did. Personally, I think there's a lot that we can learn from these resources in regards to understanding ways of being that recognized and affirmed human diversity in relation to gender and sexuality, and the sacredness and the interrelatedness of all creation. I had the distinct pleasure of working together with the young people who self-identify as 2S LGBTQI+, or questioning their gender and sexual identity, or who are allies to friends and loved ones here in Windsor, Essex for the past 7 years, and for almost the same amount of time involved with the public school board. I appreciate the efforts here in Windsor, Essex by not only the school boards, but also the broader community to show their support for human diversity, especially in relation to gender and sexuality. Much has changed in the past decade, in part due to legal precedents to ensure students have the opportunity to assemble and form groups like a Gender Sexuality Alliance or a Pride Club, and for all Canadians, Ontarians, the right to freedom from discrimination in relation to their gender identity and gender expression. I fully endorse the efforts the Greater Essex County District School Board has made to support the 2S LGBTQI+ students and questioning students, and the commitment they've made to make sure that all students feel a sense of belonging in their schools. As someone who's done extensive research and I provide education on topics related to gender and sexuality, I understand the current politicizing of 2S LGBTQI+ persons and trans identities in particular as part of a long-standing opposition to the naturally occurring diversity of humans in regards to gender and sexuality. This rise in targeted anti-trans organizing and increase in extreme rhetoric has a detrimental impact on young people in our schools and their families. Many young people I serve experience anti-queer and anti-trans related bullying on a regular basis, and some have had to seek transfers to avoid constant harassment. Some have left the education system altogether. As is noted in the census data that we will review later, anti-trans, anti-gay, anti-queer slurs are commonplace in our schools and creates a toxic environment for students wherein they no longer feel safe to attend school or to engage in learning. One concern about the current data that's being collected, it does not reflect the experience of those who are struggling so much within the school climate, they're unable to fulfill the requirements and graduate. It's crucial that the board remains committed to protecting the most vulnerable of students and promotes their well-being and their rights to education without fear of discrimination or mistreatment by their peers or educators. Hateful rhetoric, slurs, and demeaning language have no place in our schools, classrooms, or even families. It's crucial that each and every one of us is thoughtful and respectful with our speech and our communication. I know from conversations with the students that I serve regularly, every week we hang out on Wednesdays, most of them who are attending schools are experiencing the anti-2S LGBTQ prejudice from their peers and some from the educating and staffing of our schools. Most of them are struggling with feeling that there's adequate support for addressing the prejudice and mistreatment they experience. For some, this has negatively impacted their ability to contribute to the learning environment and achieve their full potential in relation to academic achievement and socialization. And I know several of my teens who have abandoned their education altogether because of that. I want to applaud the Greater Essex County District School Board for investing in robust supports for students that have been historically marginalized and are currently experiencing disproportionate rates of decreased academic achievement and a sense of belonging in their schools. As we struggle against deficits, budget cuts, and austerity measures, it's crucial we don't lose these newly integrated supports for those that have been failed by a system that was not designed for them. Equity is an investment. It's worth making every time. It benefits every student by building a stronger foundation for those that are least served and even marginalized by the service itself, which some of our students have reported. I know that the specialized supports that have been developed to support the 2S LGBTQIA+ students and the questioning students have been very well received and made a meaningful difference in the lives of those who've accessed them, because I talked to them about it. These supports often have a significant positive impact on their sense of belonging and well-being within their schools and have contributed to their ability to achieve academic success and beyond that, to be able to develop into healthy, happy young adults who contribute to their communities and are getting towards developing their own families. I fully encourage the board to follow the recommendations that you'll see to provide 2S LGBTQI+ students with better access to specialized in-school supports, such as social workers and extracurricular groups and activities. All students should know that their well-being and safety is important, that their perspectives appreciated and their voices are valued. No one should fear being discriminated against or treated with prejudice or violence because of their identity, and we all share a responsibility to ensure that everyone experiences the freedoms to be themselves and express their person without fear or mistreatment. It's critical that the board also follows the recommendations to develop policies and procedures that will foster a positive and supportive learning environment for 2S LGBTQI+ students, as well as better equip the staff to interrupt and address homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia when it occurs. We are fortunate to live in this time in Canada as many aspects of our person are protected in legislation and policies. These enshrined rights and freedoms were hard fought for and won. And now we find ourselves in the middle of a significant struggle against social conservative backlash and anti-2S LGBTQI+ prejudice and hate. And we find ourselves on the vanguard, protecting human rights, ending oppression, injustice, and unfairness. It is so important that homophobic, transphobic, and all forms of discriminatory behavior on any grounds are no longer tolerated at all. And that there's consequences for engaging in those kind of behaviors and for ignoring them when others engage in them. Anti-queer, anti-trans, and anti-gay prejudice and hate affects all of us, and inclusive practices and an affirming orientation to all of our differences benefits everyone. Acceptance and celebration of human diversity allow all of us greater freedom to be our authentic self safely, whether we're queer, trans, or just a weirdo, and all the kind of ways we're unique. In closing, I want to thank you so much for all of your time and labors. It is not unappreciated. It is deeply appreciated. I appreciate being able to speak tonight in support of the report from the student census. I fully endorse the recommendations from the census data in regard for supports to better the sense of belonging and the academic achievement for 2S LGBTQI+ students and really all students. Thank you so much for your efforts to support all of our young people in all of our schools in our entire community. These efforts have not only enhanced students' experience in our schools, but has saved lives. And I think that's the reality of how important this work is. And I work with some of these youth, and they're really struggling, but they get to come in every week to hang out with other people kind of like them in an environment where no matter who they are, they're welcomed and they're loved and cherished, and they're given pizza and snacks, and we have a good time. And they feel hopeful because they have that to look forward to. I want them to be hopeful for every day and look forward to every day, getting to go to school. Because school can be fun. And it can be a great place to learn amongst friends and peers and cool adults who know a whole bunch of things, willing to share. And I hope that with the recommendations put forward and working on those things, making them actions, that all students are going to get to enjoy their schools as like the best place other than home, because that's a great place too. So thank you all so much, and I really appreciate the chance to be a delegation tonight. I yield the floor.
Thank you very much.
Happy Pride.
Just stay there for a moment while I check to see if any of the trustees have any questions regarding your presentation. Don't see any hands up. It was an excellent presentation. That's probably why they have no questions.
Oh, thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Have
My
a
pleasure.
great evening. Our next speaker is Nancy Campana. Welcome, Nancy. And you also have up to 10 minutes.
I'm a little shorter than Derek, and Derek is a very hard act to follow. Good evening. My name is Nancy Campana, and I'm the co-founder of the Run for Rocky Legacy Project and the mother of Rocky Campana, who was a student in the Greater Essex County District School Board at Sandwich West Public School and Sandwich Secondary School. For those of you who do not know Rocky's story and his legacy that has been left behind, you can find the story at runforrocky.com. A short summary is that Rocky struggled with depression that did not become evident until the end of his life. At a dinner I shared with Rocky near the end of his life, he told me that his high school years were some of the toughest years that he had experienced. Anyone who knew Rocky during these years would have been shocked to hear this, as he thrived both academically and socially. However, being accepted for the person he was and not his sexuality often saddened him, and he found the world a very mean place to live. In high school, he did not have a place or a club to call his own, and that was especially difficult. There were no pride flags raising, no GSA clubs, both of which Rocky would have proved of vital importance to himself. And I know Carrie, who's sitting in this class, in this boardroom, taught Rocky, and I think she would completely agree. Rocky came out at the age of 17 while attending grade 11, and I dare to say he was one of the only out students at Sandwich Secondary School at the time. He took his partner to the Sandwich prom in grade 12, and I was told by a gay friend that he should be careful that he was not too out, as it could be harmful for him. Rocky was determined to be out and proud, and as a family, we could not have been more prouder of him. Rocky took his life in August of 2012, and in April of 2013, the first Run for Rocky took place to commemorate the advocacy work that Rocky had done within the community while he was alive and the work that he wanted to do in his very bright future at the time. I would like to acknowledge the great commitment that the Greater Essex County District School Board has had from day one under the leadership of Warren Kennedy to embrace the first Run for Rocky Legacy project and the funding model within this board. This school year in particular, we have seen more collaborative work to ensure that 2S LGBTQIA+ students are supported than in the 12-year history of working with the Greater Essex County District School Board. I am here to encourage the board that this work needs to be continued and expanded as suggested under the census report. As part of the advisory committee that was able to view the recent student census survey results, it truly saddened me but did not surprise me to see that 2S LGBTQIA+ students are the group within the Greater Essex County District School Board that are struggling the most. During a time when this marginalized community, and most specifically transgender youth, are being targeted and used as political pawns, on top of the proliferation of this anti-trans movement being easily accessible for all to see on social media, it is no doubt a very challenging time for these youth and their families. This portion of your student population is more fearful, have more anxiety, feel more defeated and helpless. I can confidently state that the potential that your 2S LGBTQIA+ students have is limitless. The hurdles they face in life are often larger compared to students of non-marginalized groups. These students can overcome these challenges with strong support within the education system and can move on to be amazing members of their communities and country. And although Derek mentioned that families are a great place, we have to acknowledge that for many of these students, all they have is school. They do not have family support. It never ceases to amaze me when we present the yearly Run for Rocky GSA Leadership Scholarships, which I just had the pleasure of doing this afternoon. What amazing youth that we have in our local schools amongst GSA student leaders. These students are resilient advocates who are changing their schools, but need as much help and support as we can give them. We must remember that for every school who has a brave student that stands up in their GSA club, there are one or two more students who cannot walk through those doors. And I think the report states that as well. These students often silently suffer, and the built-in support within the school system is paramount for them. The number of graduates who have received the Rocky Campana GSA Leadership Scholarship over the years that have moved on to positions in fields of human rights, politics, working for 2S LGBTQIA plus agencies, and in feminism roles is countless. And Megan Jubenville, who is sitting in the audience tonight, is one of the products of your school system, who is a leader at Trans Wellness Windsor. Many of these scholarship recipients attribute their career direction to being part of their GSA in their high school and having the right support needed at an instrumental time in their life. It is vital that this board examines the student census and recommendations that have come from analyzing the data collected very thoughtfully and thoroughly. 2S LGBTQIA plus students within your board are telling you very directly what they need and have been telling you what they need for years. The recommendations outlined are vital to ensure that these students are supported in your school system and that they feel safe when they go to school daily, that they do not experience school avoidance, and they do not feel bullied or simply being out is dangerous. Consideration to cut budgetary items in this area should not be a consideration at all. You have a responsibility to adopt the recommendations being tabled. This responsibility is being extended can be extended and can save lives and will most definitely ensure that 2S LGBTQIA plus students can thrive within your board. I fully endorse the recommendations from the census data in regards for supports to better the sense of belonging and academic achievement for these students. You have the capacity to make decisions that are needed to ensure that senior grade school and high school years of 2S LGBTQIA plus students are not the worst years of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Are there any questions from trustees regarding her presentation? Seeing none, I want to thank you very much for coming to us tonight and sharing. Excellent presentation as well, so thank you very much. Okay, I don't have speakers list paper in front of me, so I'm assuming there's nobody on it. Okay, thank you. And new business, there's no new business at this time. We do have some reports to be received. K1 has a presentation by Tana Turner, and Superintendent Howard will start the rest of that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really excited to have Tana Turner with us on the line. Tana is from Turner Consulting and has been an integral member of ensuring that this process, which is a second phase of the census data that we collected last year, was detailed in order of next steps that we can serve our students better and all of our students better. So I'm going to pass it over to Tana.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and are the slides up?
Yes, it is.
Okay, wonderful. So certainly happy to be with you tonight to present really an overview of the census portraits that were developed using the data from the first student census that was conducted at the end of the previous school year. The next slide just has some key points just to remind you about the context for this work. The Ministry of Education has recognized that racism and other forms of oppression negatively impact the academic outcomes and well-being for students from various communities. And as a result, the government has required that all school boards in Ontario conduct a student census and analyze the data collected to identify what the issues are for these groups of students, and then to develop plans to address the issues. So in 2016, the Ministry of Education released the Ontario Education Equity Action Plan that all school boards are accountable to implement. In 2017, the provincial government passed the Anti-Racism Act. That requires the collection of identity-based data by school boards using the data standards, which were published in 2018. The ministry required all school boards to collect identity-based data for students by the end of 2023. So that's what Greater Essex County District School Board did in conducting its first census at the end of the previous school year. And school boards are also required to analyze this data and to analyze this data with community to identify and address any disparities or disproportionalities experienced by various groups of students. And the analysis of the data really will help the board meet its legal obligations to provide public education equitably for all groups of students. And that's public education that's free from discrimination and harassment, as required by the Education Act and the Ontario Human Rights Code. Next slide. So this school year, I worked with the board on this project to analyze the student data that was collected in the previous school year. So in terms of the process, we did develop advisory groups to work with us to help review the data and provide insights into the data issues that groups of students were experiencing. They contributed to the analysis that was conducted, and the data that was collected through the census survey was merged with information from your student information system, and we worked with the advisory groups to gather their insights into what are the key issues and what is the data that we need to look at to explore some of these issues. And certainly, too, they provided guidance for engaging with the community and consulting with respect to hearing various perspectives to help us interpret the data and to make recommendations. So that was the next phase with respect to consulting with the community. And certainly, too, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Education requires that school boards engage with members of the school community in order to analyze and interpret the results of the student census data. While the data itself is important, certainly understanding the context that produces some of these outcomes is even more important. And certainly we need to understand the lived experiences of the students represented by that data. So we did participate or hold a series of consultations and then summarize, because certainly there was a lot of data. And so what we wanted to do was just summarize the academic achievement data, well-being data, and certainly to summarize the input and recommendations that were gathered through the consultations. And on the next slide, we just have a list of the various community consultations that were held. And in terms of engaging with the community, information was sent out to staff. It was sent out to parents, many groups of students as well, and in the broader community through community organizations and places of worship as well. And certainly we wanted a broad range of participants in order to gather various perspectives with respect to student experiences at Greater Essex County. The consultations with respect to the 2S LGBTQIA plus students were held online. So we did have an online survey and then engaged with school GSAs and as well as students through the annual GSA conference. We did also have additional sessions with Middle Eastern and Black staff, along with members of a school parent council to gather additional insights. So in total, 395 students, parents and guardians, staff, community members participated in these consultations and served on the advisory committees as well. I just want to flag one thing. Certainly while there was a sufficient number of Indigenous students to conduct an analysis, when we met with the Indigenous Education Council, they noted that the number of self-identified Indigenous students that they have differed greatly from the number of students who identified on the student census. So they did want to, or they did not want to use the student census data to assess outcomes because they felt it really undercounted the number of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. So the next slide just highlights some of the findings with respect to academic achievement and well-being. And first off, there were some groups of students, specifically to LGBTQIA+, Middle Eastern, East Asian, and South Asian students that overall outperformed all students. So certainly with respect to academic achievement, the issues, really were with respect to students with disabilities and Black students. And these two groups experienced gaps in academic achievement and experienced higher suspension rates when compared with all students. But certainly for well-being, we did note that all of these groups reported that they experienced bullying based on their identities. And certainly many of these students also report lower levels of well-being. So while there's some that may be doing well academically, certainly there are issues with respect to well-being. And as the two speakers noted, certainly much more that teachers, staff, and school and system leaders can do to create a more welcoming and inclusive environment and addressing some of the issues of bullying and exclusion when they do occur. Next slide. So what we did with the data was create 6 census portraits that have been shared with you. I believe what's in your packet is the accessible version. On the screen are the designed versions that will be shared. And what we wanted to do, first of all, on that first page was really provide an overview of the diversity within each of these groups of students. Certainly what we heard through the consultations is that certainly within each of these groups, there's a good deal of diversity, which then impacts the experiences of students. And we also wanted to highlight the intersectionality as well. So, for example, as the two speakers just highlighted with respect to experiences of 2S LGBTQIA+ students, certainly that's one group, but those students also may have a disability, also may be Black, also may be East Asian or South Asian or Middle Eastern. So certainly that just adds to the complexity of some of the issues that they may also be facing, and that the board then needs to also be paying attention to. On the following pages, we do provide a summary of academic achievement and well-being data, and really just pulled out some of the key indicators for the board. And then on the final page, we provide a summary of what we heard from the consultations. Certainly that will help add some context to help us understand the data, as well as the recommendations that were made through the consultations to address the issues that were identified. On the next slide, what we've done is just summarize some of the input from the consultations. And one thing that I just want to highlight is that there were very similar discussions amongst the groups, and certainly very similar recommendations were made. In some cases, there are recommendations specific to us LGBTQIA+ students, specific to students with disabilities, but certainly there was a good deal of overlap with respect to what some of the issues and recommendations were. I'm not going to read through all of the input, but just to give you some highlights. Certainly what we heard from just about all the groups was the need to diversify the educators and staff hired by the school board. And so it's important with respect to students, seeing themselves reflected at the front of the class, in leadership throughout the school board. Certainly to then, amongst all staff, there was the recommendation around the professional learning and the resources that they need to help them foster an inclusive learning environment, and for teachers and other staff to address bullying and inappropriate behaviors when they do occur. Certainly what we heard was sometimes these behaviors occur without a teacher or staff present, but sometimes they occur in the presence of a staff person who doesn't intervene. So certainly the board needs to provide the skills and expectations for staff about what to do in those situations. Certainly, too, we heard from parents and guardians that they would like to hear more from the school board, that there's a lot of misinformation about what's being taught to their students. And certainly that, they said they would like increased engagement and communication from the school board. And certainly, too, that they would like more information just to help them understand and navigate the education system. And not just specific or generally the education system in Ontario, but specific to this school board. We did hear from some parents who had gone to, had their child in another school district, and moving here had to relearn the acronyms, processes, etc., because they were different. So certainly parents wanted more information to help them understand and navigate the education system, and certainly too, if they're to effectively advocate for their children, they need that information, and it's very important. Certainly too, we heard that students and parents need more information to help them understand the various education pathways that are available to them. We talked about the reflecting the diversity of students, not only with respect to staff, but also with respect to the images in the classrooms, the resources that are used, the curriculum that's used, etc. So that was very important, and certainly too, some of the racial groups noted that they have a rich and diverse culture but they don't see that it's reflected in the classroom. And certainly that some of the bullying or the inappropriate comments, etc., that they get from other students are because of their lack of knowledge of different cultures. So certainly that came up a number of times from various groups. We also heard that students, parents, and staff may not feel comfortable coming forward with issues and certainly wanted the opportunity to be able to share their concerns anonymously. As I said, we did hear very specific concerns with respect to 2S LGBTQIA+ students and students with disabilities. And just a few here with respect to students with disabilities around maintaining specialized programs. Certainly there was, in the conversations, really positive comments about how these programs have benefited their students, but certainly recognition that that there's underfunding of these programs. And some folks felt that the school board should advocate with the Ministry of Education for more community-based services for children with disabilities. And certainly, too, that accommodations should be made for students with disabilities when school policies or procedures negatively impact them. So that's just really a short list of the input from the consultations. And as the previous speaker spoke to the issues and concerns with respect to 2S LGBTQIA+ students, there were some specific recommendations for those students as well. Okay, next slide. So what we wanted to do with those census profiles was really, number one, feedback to the community about the census, and certainly help staff as well understand the value of the census data, and understand what's happening for students. And I know sometimes with these, with diverse communities, people may experience certain things in the education system, but not really understand whether or not it's just their own individual experience or whether or not issues are more systemic. And certainly this will help them with that understanding, and then help staff and school leaders and system leaders understand what these issues are and what more they could be doing. But certainly, too, the information is really useful and has been used to help finalize the education action plan for the school board as well. So I will hand it over to Superintendent Howitt to speak to this.
So thank you, Tana. And as Tana mentioned, first of all, I would like to thank Tana Turner. It's been an absolute pleasure working with her since the fall. She's really a special person and really guided the process really well and is trusted by community. And I'm very, very grateful. The system is very grateful for her leadership and guidance that way. As on the screen, you'll see that the census reports are going to the advisory committees tomorrow officially. They will be posted on our websites and transparent about the work that we've done and what the recommendations are in moving forward. And the next report on the agenda, I believe, is the equity action plan that's been developed. These census reports and the recommendations that have been made have fed some of the equity report, but these finalized recommendations may feed the equity report additionally. And that equity report is done in a malleable fashion, and that we can adjust it accordingly based on the needs, and so that we can be responsive to our communities over the 5-year span of the report. So I'm really grateful to all the community members that came out for consultation and the people that came and joined the advisory committees. They attended 5 meetings individually, and in addition, many of those people came and joined the consultation meetings as well. So they were very committed to doing the work, and there were wonderful parents who just said, I just want to be part of my child's experience and help to support really a great experience. And if there's any questions, Tana or myself would be glad to answer.
Trustee Buckler, you have a question?
I'm sure I didn't hear correctly. How many students' feedback did we get in this, and out of how many? Because I know we serve about 33,000 students, and I thought I had heard 395, and I thought that's impossible. I didn't hear that correctly.
Tana, maybe you can clarify that. I think it's people who came out for consultation sessions. That's where people who
Yeah.
came out for the consultation sessions.
Well, the consultations or that completed the online survey.
Sorry, I'm looking for the numbers. How much feedback did we get? What are the numbers, and how many were we looking for? Like, what do we do? High school students alone, or I'm just curious to see what percentage of the population we captured here.
So we had, Tana, if you can clarify too, the number of students, we had about 51% of our population or 56% respond to the census. And when we did the advisory groups, overall, there were 395 people that participated in those sessions. Yeah.
Point 4 information, Madam Chair. Page 5, I think it's listed. Yeah, okay.
Any other questions for Tana or Superintendent Howard? Trustee Chen?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation and all the endeavor that you have done. And I read through those the data survey results. Seems we don't have much. We didn't find significant gap in the data, significant difference. Our reports mainly come from the scenario interviews, and I wonder what's the situation of the overall provincial level, compared with our board. Seems our board did a good job, and I wonder if you can share some information, the overall provincial level, what's the situation? Is there any much gap found from the data or not? Thank you.
I'll start, Tana. Is that okay, or would you like to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll start in terms of the discrepancies or in the data. You said there wasn't very much of a gap. In fact, if you read the reports very deeply, you'll see, and Tana provided a general overview, in some groups of students outperformed all students, but there are students that are underperforming regularly, and that's a sign that we need to do something to intervene. But what was really clear in the data is all of those groups were impacted from a social emotional perspective, from a well-being perspective, and some groups particularly so. And our two speakers this evening eloquently spoke about that impact for students that identify as 2S LGBTQIA+. And so what has come up in the recommendations is saying, hey board, these are some things that you need to really, really consider if you want to say that you're keeping all students safe. And you're supporting all students in their overall academic performance as well. So Tana, I don't know if you can speak on a provincial level with other work that you've done.
Well, with respect to the provincial level, the Minister of Education has put out the Student Achievement Plan, which identifies the data points that every school board needs to report on. Once they collect that data, we'll be able to compare Greater Essex County data to the provincial level. But at this point, there isn't, I don't believe, or I haven't seen any provincial level data that we can compare to.
Thank you. Trustee Nelson?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Considering the intersectionalities, does the recommendations fully support those who are affected, or is there more work that we need to do, more recommendations or more research?
I don't know. Tana, did you hear that?
Yeah, sorry, I just need some clarification on the question. So considering intersectionality, are you just asking, do we have enough data to be able to examine
Yes,
address
and do the recommendations apply to those who are affected by intersectionalities?
Yeah. Certainly, this is the beginning. There is more that can be done to explore, students with various identities. And I don't want the board to think this is the end of the process. You have the data and certainly can ask and answer many more questions. So, for example, with respect to 2S LGBTQIA plus students, we didn't do a breakdown by racialized group to see do they have different experiences, right? So the data is there, but that additional analysis has not yet been done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any Trustee Sipkar?
Yeah, thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the comprehensive both presentation but also report tonight and the recommendations. And I know that we have an upcoming operations and finance meeting, so I won't get ahead of ourselves. But my curiosity really was how are we realigning our resources to be able to support these recommendations? And I guess I know that you probably can't point to a specific thing either in this report, the census report, or in the equity action plan. But I'm just curious if this, what this has meant for the allocation of resources in the budget that would be coming forward to us. And I understand it's a very big question, but I really think that's where my mind goes with these types of reports. Thanks.
Thank you, through Madam Chair. Certainly, we will be discussing that this evening. From a funding perspective, we received $226,000 from the ministry for a graduation coach. There are no other funding supports, unfortunately, for equity. However, we are proposing in the preliminary budget expenditures of up to $1.3 million to support not only full-time equivalent positions to support the work in this, but also a lot of professional learning related to the work to assist in this.
Elementary, go ahead.
Thank you. As a supplemental question, I guess my question would be maybe for Superintendent Howitt or Director Houston. Do we feel that our board is well positioned to act on all of these recommendations, considering the funding constraints that we're under? I'll give that one to Director Houston.
Thank you for that. So through you, Madam Chair, I think Superintendent Armstrong made it very clear what we get from the ministry. So from a ministry perspective, no, we're not. From a board perspective, we're going to bring forward some recommendations. It's a 5-year plan for this, as well as our equity plan, right? Like there's multiple plans. Our Dismantling Anti-Black Racism is a 5-year plan. And I absolutely appreciate that people don't want 5 years of waiting. I get it. They've waited long enough. But because of some budget constraints, we came up with what we thought was reasonable to do the work for next year, and we'll continue to come back asking every year for funding to support it.
Trustee Chin, is there anybody that hasn't asked questions yet? Okay, go ahead, Trustee Chin.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I saw there is, the suggestions, they are very good. And there is one is that to increase communication with parents and students from diverse background and provide opportunities for students and parents to share concerns anonymously. My question is that, can you clarify, do you provide opportunities for to share their concerns just anonymously, or if they come openly to share their concerns, what's your suggestions? Thank you.
You want?
So through you, Madam Chair, when people do come forward, not anonymously, we address those. However, whether it's through human resources, if it's related to staff, or if it's student to student, whatever that happens to be, we address those. And I did share at the last board meeting, when there was questions asked around the anonymous reporting tool, that is in the works, and that when that is completed, that will be available to people as well, but that is something that we're still working on.
To that? Okay. Then we have
Okay.
Trustee Sipcar next.
Okay, my concerns is that if parents come to the public board meeting to share their concerns, how would we treat them? And, do we have to respect them or just cut them? Thank you.
So I'll address part of that, Madam Chair. If parents have concerns about their individual children, a public board meeting is not the place for that, to bring those concerns forward in order to protect the child, because we don't have people come speaking individually about their own children. And our process would be that they would contact the school administrator, classroom teacher, school administrator. If they're not satisfied, then they would contact the school superintendent. If they're still not satisfied, they're welcome to contact me anytime, and we work through that process. And I know you, as well as trustees, receive those, and that you forward them to me, and then I work with my staff in order to address those. But a public board meeting is not a place for individual concerns around students.
Trustee Sipcar?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a final guest comment really on the 2S LGBTQIA student recommendations, and also thank our speakers for coming tonight. I think this is, from my recollection, one of the most comprehensive, I think, set of recommendations specifically for this marginalized group. And I think that, and it was also mentioned tonight that in the last year or so, the board has really undertaken this work with more robustness. And so I just want to say thank you for that. And I'm glad that that is not just, a kind of a side note or a footnote. It's front and center in this work. I think that it's a really critical part of the work that the Greater Essex Board does in our community. And I thank our community partners for bringing the issues forward and encouraging us forward in that direction. So thank you.
Okay. We're going to move on to K2. I just want to say thank you to Tana for all of the work on this census this past year. Also to Superintendent Howitt for all of her work, and all of the team that supports them in this work. I'm sure I don't even begin to know all of the staff that we have that are part of the work that has been done around the census, but you know who you are, and I thank you, and all of the trustees, I thank you on their behalf for all of this work. It's greatly appreciated. Now, moving on to K2, Equity Plan Report. Are there any questions around the Equity Plan Report for admin? Sipcar?
Yeah, thank you. My question really has to do more with how this is positioned within the broader equity work of the Greater Essex County District School Board. Because I noticed that the following item after that is the GIAD update report. And it seems like there is a natural kind of like overlap or hand in hand kind of nature when I read both of them. And I was just wondering, is the equity plan report, it's coming out of the census, is that going to be the plan kind of going on a go forward basis? And is that kind of update report still, I don't want to say not relevant, it seems more operational in a way. And so I'm just curious how those two kind of fit together. I think Director Housen's reading my mind.
Who's wanting this? Superintendent?
I'll start it out. So how we developed the plan was really organic, and we looked at the data from our system. We looked at the backgrounder report from the Dismantling Anti-Black Racism. We looked at the strategy. We looked at our census data. We looked at student voice data, and we spent a day sifting through data, and people that were part of the Justice, Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity Committee, who are representative in of varying bargaining groups and various lived experience and intersectionality were the people who were doing that work, and they view it differently, right? So it was our data that was being viewed. And then we looked at examples of district school boards that had similar profiles to us to help guide that work. So I must acknowledge the Justice, Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity Committee for organically identifying those domains and then engaging in the work of what does that look like, sound like. And then we had the data from the census, and it was like evident. And we talked about it at Directors Council, like we need to do something. It's punching us in the face, right? So you're right, it ebbs and flows with all of the work that we're doing. And the idea that it's like a working document is because we need to be responsive as things are happening, that it can't be static. And that is particularly that we're listening to our families and that we're listening to the students that we serve. Because when students are speaking to us and telling us something, we need to listen. So that's the idea of how the plan was developed and that it intersects in all other areas.
Thank you. And as a quick supplemental, so if I understand, and I appreciate that background of how that plan developed, and I think it's really beautiful that it kind of happened in that kind of more organic and iterative way. On the report, then, if I'm understanding it correctly, not to jump ahead, but it's almost like it's kind of like the update from the committee work in a way. So those are the differences. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, anyone with question on the equity plan report specific? Trustee Chin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is that the 1.3 million that we put on that kind of EDI, and is there any reference for that? And compared with other board, what's the level of our this kind of this much of input? And what's the rationality for putting this kind of money on that? Because I didn't see the data really, has strong support for, we have a lot of gap to do that. And because we do have, deficit, huge deficit, and this 1.3 million, so what's the rationale of putting this amount of money on that?
So
Superintendent.
if I can start, maybe if anybody wants to chime in, I think our data is telling us that we need to be responsive to the students that we serve. And our community is highly diverse. And so when students are in risk, like just the dismantling anti-Black racism report, that alone, and if you have a plan, you have to have dollars behind it to support that plan. It's hollow unless you align it with funding to support that work. So our dismantling anti-Black racism plan, we are funded for a Black graduation coach, and that's it. But we also have our CYFs that support not only Black students, but marginalized students. Extremely important positions within the district in meeting the needs of students. All you have to do is come and speak to our Black Student Advisory Committee. Sit with them. I'm with them tomorrow. I can't wait to be with them. They'll tell you what's happening in schools and what needs to happen. They met and they were so articulate in meeting with Tana to tell them, here's some things that need to be done for us to, do well in schools. The same when we met with our South Asian and our East Asian, there were students that were in those sessions speaking about what they experience in schools, and we must be responsive to it. We jockey back and forth between the third and fourth most culturally diverse city in all of Canada. If we don't put dollars attached to addressing the needs of the students, that's problematic. And our two speakers tonight, and that was the most alarming when you saw the social emotional component in the census data, but especially for 2S LGBTQ students, and we had our speakers speak tonight about that it saves lives. We must align dollars to be able to support that for our students. So 1.3 is a really conservative number, considering the deficit and what we're dealing with, and trying to do our very best to meet the needs of students, so that every student that crosses the threshold of the schools that they go to feels safe and can thrive, not only academically, but emotionally. So I would argue that, I wish we had more money. I really do.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that it's very important to have money to do that. My question is that comparing with other board, what's the level of our input and provincial level, and compared with other board, how other board put this kind of.
So through you, Madam Chair, it would be extremely difficult to compare because we all have different priorities. Superintendent Howitt spoke about how diverse our community is. I can't compare that to Lambton Kent, who has this much diversity in the needs of their students. So we've done an incredible amount of data gathering to inform the decisions that we're making about how to allocate our resources for greater Essex students. I can't say what does Toronto spend based on their demographics, because those are their individual board decisions that they need to make about their students and their community. So to compare them, you're not even comparing apples and an orange, because those are both fruits. You're comparing very, very different things about the needs of our community and our students. I don't think we could honestly compare to anybody else.
Trustee Burgess.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I have a sort of a similar question, but it's just for clarification in a way. Because I think this is an ambitious plan. I want to really thank everybody. Everybody's heard it. Thank you so much for putting this together. But when you said you ran a comparator with statistically like boards or whatever, and I'm thinking that they're not boards that may have the same 36,000 students and the same, percentage appointed specifically to an DEI line versus, the entire budget. It's statistically similar in the demographics that we have. So I'm thinking it's Toronto or Waterloo or Peel or Hamilton or Ottawa or one of those, major, like larger cities even. But that have that level, like you said, third or fourth of in the nation of diversity, let alone, I don't know how we stack up with, 2SL LGBTIQ plus, or I don't, comparatively, but I would think that we're probably there as well, since we've been, comparative to that. So I just wanted to say, am I right in thinking that, like the one, when we compare or how we're doing or whatever, who we go to glean the information is probably not Hastings and Prince Edward.
In fact, two of them that I can recall off the top of my head was Waterloo and Thames Valley. Yeah, Thames Valley was another one. And we looked, and they had done some advancement work with it. And so all of this work too is based on relationships, the people that you connect with across boards, and understanding how they did the work as well was really important. But those are the two that I remember off the top of my head.
Okay, this will be the last question. I want to move on to the next report and get questions. We have a lot of other material tonight.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I remember last meeting, the strategic plan, and our priority is student achievement, and we have a list, and the EDI was not in the top list. So that makes me concerned if we have a huge deficit and we have a number that we think we need to put, and how do we relate to the strategic plan, the priorities that we have based on the, based on the, how to say that, consensus from the parents, from the students. And if they list the student achievement as the highest priority, and how we balance the budget deficit, and with the amount 1 million money we put on EDI, and how do we balance that?
I'll go to Director House then the first this time.
That's okay, through you, Madam Chair, and you're welcome to add at the end if there's anything. So our whole purpose is student achievement. in education, I would find it really difficult to believe that if a child doesn't feel safe at school, they're not going to be able to learn. That Maslow's hierarchy of needs is very basic. Around your first need is to feel safe. So if they're not feeling safe, and our speaker spoke to this tonight, some aren't even coming to school. So there is no student achievement there. Those that are coming, some are not feeling safe at school. We need to create those conditions. And I don't see EDI as a separate. When you talk about how we listed our priorities, they're not separate. They're embedded in every single thing that we do, not as a separate entity, because it shouldn't be. It should be about in everything we do, we're looking at it from an equity lens about who needs the most in order to be successful and put our resources towards that.
Thank you. Not right now. We've got to move on. We've got a lot coming on. But I will say to all the trustees, you are more than welcome to do follow-up questions with Superintendent Howitt or with Director Howson, or if it's related to the budget, with Superintendent Armstrong. That goes for everybody because we need to move on. There's K3, Justice, Inclusion, Equity, Diversity Update Report. Are there any questions on that report? Moving to K4, the GECPIC report. It was enclosed as well. Any questions regarding the GECPIC report? And moving on, International Languages report we also received. Questions on that? Okay, thank you. We will move on. And if some questions come up, we all know how to contact the superintendents responsible to ask those questions, okay? We always have that opportunity to call them and ask the questions as they arise. Okay, moving on to trustee question period. Are there any questions for this committee tonight? Seeing none, are there any notices of motion for the Education Committee? Announcements. Superintendent Howitt. There's going to be a number of them, and I think she's going to highlight.
Yeah, just two quick slides here. And I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague, Superintendent Raquel Roberts, Superintendent Dubin, Superintendent Mills, and myself. We're really excited to embark on our 15th summer, providing a wide variety of programs for students within our elementary schools each year. We endeavor to provide as many varied and unique opportunities as possible to support our students across the system. Our first slide highlights the 6 different camps that will be offered this summer from July 2nd to July 19th. As you can see on the slide, we offer camps focused on literacy, numeracy, integration of STEAM within our Camp Wonder Junior, Camp Motivate programs, and our Camp Megazay program is for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students who engage in land-based learning experiences which infuse cultural components and Indigenous language learning into the program. Camp MKK and Camp NIA programs are for Black students. During Camp MKK and Camp NIA, and the GECDSB staff and community partners will work collaboratively to provide experiences that focus on Black heroes in the arts and in STEM. And the second slide talks about, shares that not only the campsites, but highlights our community partnerships that enhance and enrich our camp and our program goals. Each year we strive to embed a number of different experiences for our students that help them learn and grow in multiple ways. As you can see, we have 6 hub sites with multiple camps are offered at each of these sites. Each year we marvel at how students, staff, and families within each of these sites form such a strong and lasting bond with each other in just a 3-week period. It's extraordinary. I always say that Disneyland comes to the Greater Essex in July. We're very pleased to offer 2 community land-based sites this year for Camp Megazay. It's going to be at Ojibwe and at Hillman Marsh this year. And that was based on the guidance from our IAC that was looking for an opportunity in the county for students. Community partners are critical to the success of our program. Our swimming and recreation programs at the University of Windsor and our swimming and nature fresh are a highlight of the camps each year. This year we are pleased to work with Art Windsor Essex. Super excited about that, to have visits both at the gallery within our schools. The United Way, an amazing partner, has been significant in their contribution over a number of years and provides us with healthy, hot, and nutrition lunches each day. And for all of our partners, they've done just an amazing job. Parent engagement is a central component of the camp, and we love having our weekly parent engagement sessions, as well as sharing good news with families in our weekly newsletters and our videos. We look forward to another great summer for our students.
Thank you for those excellent announcements. Love to hear about great stuff for our students. Are there any announcements from the trustees? I will very quickly highlight, this is National Indigenous History Month, also Pride Month. We're celebrating. And by the way, I discovered today, I didn't realize this, but Windsor celebrates this week Crossing Guard Appreciation Week from June 3rd to the 7th. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. No one told me. I, they can get acknowledged again. So we have Shavuot begins June 11th, Eid on June 16th, and June 19th is Juneteenth. And let's not forget June 21st, National Indigenous Peoples Day. There are others up there, so I won't read them all off, but those were just some of the highlights. And Ron, you can pick off something that's not, that I didn't mention. Pardon? Oh, Trustee Burgess has one.
Madam Chair, I think this is the last education meeting of this school year.
Of this school year, but we're
Yes.
still going to be around in
Yes,
October.
but for this school year, I think what we'd like to maybe announce is that there are going to be a lot of graduates, and we wish them all very, very well, and thank you for all the efforts throughout this school year, and to enjoy that summer.
Thank you. And now we will momentarily switch into Ops and Finance meeting, and you can watch us switch if you'd like. Okay, where do I go?
To order of the Standing Committee of the Operations and Finance. Our attendance is the same as the previous meeting. Approval of the agenda. Trustee Buckler, seconded by Trustee Nelson, all in support. That's carried. Declaration of conflict of interest. Are there any conflicts? Seeing none. Approval of the minutes from May 7th, 2024 of this committee. Trustee Buckler, seconded by Trustee McKinley, all in support. That's carried. Business arising from the minutes. Any business arising from the minutes? There is no business arising. And we are now on to a very important item, which is the 2024-25 draft budget. I've been told we have 50 slides, so buckle in. Superintendent Armstrong.
Thank you. And yes, that is correct. There are 50 slides tonight. Before I begin the presentation on the 2024-25 budget, draft budget, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Mayhew and the entire finance team for their commitment and outstanding work, particularly through the budget process. With the education funding announcement arriving in late April, coupled with the work associated with March EFIS reporting, our first quarterly reporting for the in-year deficit approval, and Bill 124 remedy payments, I have a very dedicated but tired team. I am most fortunate, though, to work with these fabulous individuals. I would also like to thank my colleagues on the senior team for their frank and difficult discussions and for their collaboration as we work together to ensure that we put the students first in drafting the preliminary budget. Sorry, that's a little bit tiny. Our agenda for this evening, I'm going to go very briefly through the budget process and timelines. We've chatted about that before. Very high level again, the education funding overview, planning assumptions, the budget risks and opportunities, and then we'll take a look at the draft operating budget. We'll look at the financial overview, accumulated surplus, enrollment, funding allocation, operating expenses, budgeting for strategic priorities. Then we will discuss deficit elimination strategies and the capital budget. So the first item, very high level, I wanted to discuss is the budget process and the timelines. So this slide highlights the many budget consultation activities and reporting that have occurred in the 2024-25 budget process. Upcoming deliverables will include the approval of the 2024-25 budget, currently scheduled for June the 18th, 2024, tentatively, and the submission of the budget in EFS format to the Ministry of Education no later than June 28th, 2024. Moving on to the education funding overview. As discussed at the Operations and Finance Committee meeting of May 7th, the Ministry of Education released a new education funding formula as outlined on this slide. Core education funding replaces the former GSN and is made up of 6 funds as noted on the slide and 27 allocations. Core education funding provides permanent, ongoing operating funding to school boards and funding to maintain schools. Responsive education programs replace the former priorities and partnerships funding. There are 9 themes as noted. This funding provides targeted, temporary, and time-limited supplemental funding to school boards based on government priority themes. Capital funding is now renamed Building, Expanding, and Renewing Schools, BERS, which is just my most favorite acronym, consisting of 6 funds. BERS provides funding for the construction, purchase, additions, renovations of schools, the maintenance and improvement of the conditions of schools, and debt service costs. In response to the Better Schools and Students' Outcomes Act, the Ministry revised the 2024-25 education formula to enhance transparency and strengthen accountability in publicly funded education, to manage within the existing funding envelopes, to minimize funding redistribution impacts, and to make education funding easier to understand. The education funding formula introduces new changes for 2024-25 as highlighted on this slide. The 2021 Statistics Canada census data will be implemented over a 5-year period, impacting allocations for remote and rural, diversity and English language learners, demographic needs, safe and accepting schools, and special education. One-time funding will be provided to school boards to ensure that there is no negative impact on funding in the first year of the phase-in, and to allow school boards to adjust their cost structures. Labor-related changes include updates to salary benchmarks for ratified collective agreements and remedies payable under Bill 124. Core Ed funding provides for a 2% increase to the non-staff portions of benchmarks to assist school boards in managing increases in commodity prices, including electricity, natural gas, insurance, and other costs. Due to the requirement that all secondary students must take 1 online credit, the per pupil allocation has been adjusted to assume that 32.5% of all secondary students will take 1 online course in 2024-25. This funded class size average for an online course is 30-1 versus the in-person funded class size average of 23-1. Several transparency measures have been introduced for certain allocations, such as student safety and well-being, and a total expense limit has been implemented for school facilities and student transportation and administrative spending. Enhanced reporting and accountability measures will be required, including student transportation expenditure reporting and elementary and secondary class size compliance reporting. New funding is also being provided for school physical infrastructure renewals over a 3-year time period to support cameras, security systems, and vape detectors in schools. Moving along to the planning assumptions. The budget is predicated on 6 planning assumptions: adherence to the Education Act, alignment with the board's mission, vision, and strategic priorities, adherence to all collective agreements and contractual obligations, compliance with all Ministry of Education requirements, including in-year deficit elimination plan, conservative enrollment projections, and thoughtful use of resources in an equitable manner to meet the needs of students. Because the budget is prepared in advance and is based on assumptions and estimates, there are risks that actual results may vary from the initial budget. The key budget risks will be individually discussed in the next several slides. Enrollment projections are completed in the spring based on known registrations at the time of budget preparation. Late or delayed registrations are not captured in these projections, and changes in the enrollment may result in an increase or decrease in core education funding, specifically the declining enrollment allocation. Changes will be captured in the revised estimate submission in December 2024. Special education is underfunded based on the board's program delivery model. There are a number of students who require special education resources, and that number is growing. We have students on waiting lists. And we also offer Gains, STEPS, and RISE program models that are not funded by core education. Student needs are becoming more complex. And there's a very modest increase in the 2024-25 funding for special education, and it's primarily related to updates to salary benchmarks. And as I've mentioned, we have chronic and significant underfunding based on our board's program delivery model. It is necessary for the board to reallocate unenveloped core education funding to support the changing and the greater needs of our students. Supply costs and absences is another risk to the budget. The core education funding is insufficient to cover the projected costs related to supplies and absences. And for 2023-24, the year that we're just in, we are projecting to be underfunded by $7 million on this budget line item alone. And the board continues to experience high levels of absences. There are more complex illnesses that are being experienced by staff and more cognitive-related illnesses which contribute to that. Student transportation is another area of risk. The core education funding is insufficient to cover the projected costs. We have the cost of rising fuel, and we have bus operator contracts that have been negotiated and will be in place for 2024-25, and there's a cost increase of 3% over the prior year. And there are still challenges. We've been fortunate, but there are still challenges with driver retention and shortages that put a risk to this as well. While inflation is slowly settling, the purchasing power of the board's ministry funding continues to decline. Despite the passage of the COVID-19 pandemic, prices continue to be volatile, and vendors and service providers are not willing to hold pricing for any extended length of time. There continues to be a demand for skilled trades, particularly in the Windsor-Essex County region, with the construction of the new International Bridge Crossing, the EV battery plant, and the eventual construction of the new regional hospital. It continues to be difficult to secure services, and long lead times exist to acquire certain goods and services. While core ed funding has been increased by 2% to account for inflation, it is insufficient, particularly in the areas of utilities and insurance. As a result, administration is prioritizing and monitoring its purchasing activities carefully to account for the implicit funding reduction. Salary benchmarks and Bill 124 remedies is also another risk. The board is required to estimate the salary benchmarks for the impact of Bill 124 and the related funding. The ministry will not be updating salary benchmarks until August of 2024, after the board has submitted its budget. So there is a risk that there could be variances in the projections that we are calculating versus ministry calculated benchmarks. And quite frankly, there could be variances between us and other boards. Like, it's crazy. And then we also have the impact of unfunded positions as well. It's important also to recognize that certain board staff salaries are funded by the IRCC, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, and the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. There's been no commitment by these funding partners that they will cover the cost of Bill 124 remedies for employees that are funded by those ministries. Statutory benefits is another risk for our budget. We all know that the CPP and EI rates have increased. These are prescribed by the federal government, and there is no corresponding increase in core education funding to cover that. On the teacher salary line alone, we are projecting that the unfunded expense related to statutory benefits will be approximately $5.6 million. Near and dear to my heart, aging infrastructure. This is a significant budget risk to the board. We can't anticipate when we're going to need to do repairs and maintenance on buildings. Things break. And it's important to note as well that there is absolutely no ministry funding for administrative buildings. So for the board office or for facility services, any repairs and maintenance or any capital related items have to be funded through accumulated surplus. To add some context to the issue of aging infrastructure, this slide summarizes the square footage of the board's buildings by decade of construction. As previously discussed, the board has high facility condition indexes at many schools, which has led to greater school condition improvement and school renewal allocation funding for the past several years. Currently, 11% of the board's square footage is over 100 years old. Approximately 43%, or 1.9 million square feet of the board's buildings are 50 years or older. This is an important factor to consider, highlighting the fact that comparison to other school boards really isn't relevant. It's based on our inventory of buildings. This slide outlines the deferred maintenance across the board's facility by category. You will see on the left that we have a total of $443 million of deferred maintenance, of which $39.5 million is urgent and $122.3 million is considered high. On the right-hand side, you will see that categorized by the type of work that is required to be completed. The ministry hires third-party consultants to review school buildings for infrastructure requirements on a 5-year cycle. The ministry commenced a new 5-year cycle review in 2024. As was highlighted on the previous slide, the board has an inventory of older schools with significant needs. As new buildings are built, the deferred maintenance requirements change. However, items that were previously rated as a medium priority may become high or urgent priorities the longer it takes to address the matter. It is also important to note that the ministry has instructed boards to prioritize the spending from SCI and SRA to address facility condition, ventilation, accessibility, health and safety, and general code requirements. Claims, settlements, and other events is another risk to the budget. The board has continual exposure to claims, grievances, and legal settlements. There are some claims that are not subject to a limitation period, and some settlements which are not covered by insurance, and that would require the use of accumulated surplus. Potential claims, grievances, and legal settlements are not included in the preliminary budget due to their unpredictability and the inability to estimate a potential liability. And now I will move on to the draft 24-25 budget. This slide provides a summary of the preliminary 2024-25 budget. While an increase in operating revenue is projected, expenses of the board are projected to increase at a greater rate, resulting in a preliminary deficit for 2024-25 of $6.4 million. It is important to note that the preliminary budget is relying on $3 million of one-time revenue for the declining enrollment grant, which represents $2 million, and the release of deferred revenue in the areas of special education and student success based on changes made to the core ed funding formula. Without the reliance on this one-time funding, the preliminary deficit for 2024-25 would be $9.4 million. The preliminary budget also reflects some recommendations made by senior administration to help reduce the amount of the deficit to the $6.4 million reflected on this slide. Subsequent slides will delve deeper into the funding and the expense changes. The preliminary budget currently does not meet ministry compliance requirements. While board administration and facilities and transportation expenses are compliant, the in-year deficit exceeds 1% of the board's operating allocation by $1.9 million. As a result, Minister of Education approval is required for the preliminary in-year deficit, and an in-year deficit elimination plan must be filed. The risk profile of the board will remain unchanged, and it is likely that further monitoring or compliance measures will be implemented by the ministry. This slide provides a summary of the projected accumulated surplus. The board's operating accumulated surplus as of September 1st, 2023 was $31.4 million. Projections for 2023-24 continue to be on track for an $8.8 million deficit. When considering the preliminary 2024-25 budget, the board's operating accumulated surplus is projected to drop to $16.2 million by August 31st, 2025. This represents a 50% reduction in a 2-year time frame. As previously mentioned, the preliminary budget reflects recommendations made by senior administration to help reduce the amount of the deficit. And these are listed here for your purposes. The draft budget reflects a reduction of 22.5 FTE elementary teachers for realignment of the Tecumseh Vista Academy English Stream students to Beacon Heights. There's a reduction of 1.0 FTE secondary school literacy consultant. That position just simply isn't being renewed. There's an elimination of the secondary school part-time school aides budget to 0. The elimination of the central budget for student athletic transportation, that is now 0. There is a reduction in professional development in excess of $100,000 that would impact just about everybody in this room. There is the elimination of all contingency funds. There is nothing left in the budget for this. The furniture replacement program for 24-25 has been eliminated. Office supplies, which might sound tiny, but it's a big deal, are going to be consolidated here at the board office. The media services is going to be relocated to the board office effective January 1st, 2025, because the lease with the Essex Civic Center expires December 31st, 2024. There will be an incorporation of it reflects more aggressive rental revenues and interest income projections, which is a risk to the budget. There is a reduction in supply budgets in terms of the number of absence days we hope to experience. So that will be a lot of pressure on Superintendent Boulay to effectively manage. And there we have adjusted, and I can attest to it right now, building temperatures to mitigate utility costs. Sounds little, but you know what? Everything counts. So those things are already reflected in the $6.4 million deficit figure we've provided to you. Moving on to enrollment, a substantial amount of the board's revenue is based on student enrollment. Therefore, administration is conservative when projecting enrollment, utilizing known registrations at the time of budget preparation and students known to be returning. In elementary enrollment is projected to decrease by 328 average daily enrollment students over the 2023-24 original budget. This is primarily in the JKSK level and in grades 4 to 8. The decrease in enrollment has resulted in the board receiving the declining enrollment grant for 2024-25. This is time limited, and this is bridge funding to provide the board with time to adjust its cost structures to the lower enrollment levels. It is important to note that the ministry has cautioned school boards to be conservative in their enrollment projections, particularly for students in JKSK and international students. From a secondary panel perspective, enrollment is projected to decrease for 2024-25 by 177.5 average daily enrollment compared to the 2023-24 original budget. Other pupils of the board are to have a very modest decrease of 5.5 AGE. This slide provides a summary of enrollment over the past 4 years and the projected enrollment for 2024-25. As expected, enrollment declined in 2021, and 21-22 due to the impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. While there was a recovery in 22-23, enrollment has not returned to its pre-pandemic levels, and declining enrollment is being experienced in 23-24, with a further reduction anticipated for the upcoming school year. This slide provides a more detailed look at the preliminary funding under core education for 24-25. Core education funding is projected to increase by $5.6 million despite declining enrollment. The increase can be attributable to benchmark increases in the core education funding and specifically related to the allocations that are noted on the right-hand side of the slide. Administration's preliminary assessment is that there are no substantive changes in ministry funding. With respect to responsive education programs, the announced funding will decrease by $1.7 million over 23-24's original budget. While there are new RAP fundings for critical physical security infrastructure, amounting to $156,000 for our board, and the special education needs transition navigators of $135,000, the elimination of funding for staffing to support de-streamed and transition to high school of $1.9 million is a significant reason for the decrease overall. It's also important to note that not all REP funding has been announced by the ministry. So this is as of what was announced at budget preparation time. Other revenues are projected to increase significantly by $15.5 million, but don't get too excited. The primary reason for the increase is due to provisions for Bill 124 remedies and the release of the one-time deferred revenue as required by the ministry. The ministry is requiring that boards report these items as other revenue. These items are offset by equivalent expenditures. It should be noted that administration has been more aggressive in its projections of interest income and rental revenues, which provides a level of risk to the preliminary budget. These revenue drivers are offset by the elimination of time-limited funding as noted on this slide and classified as other revenues for budget preparation purposes. This slide provides a high-level summary of expenses, excluding the impact of the recent arbitration decision for the 2022 to 26 collective agreements for ETFO and OSSTF. The ministry will be updating salary benchmarks for the arbitration settlement and Bill 124 remedies in August of 2024. Administration will reflect all these changes in its revised budget submission in December 2024. Salaries and benefits are the largest expense for the board, representing 80% of the board's overall expenses. The decrease in instructional expenses is primarily due to the reduction of the 22.5 FTE teachers due to the realignment of the English track program at TVA to Beacon Heights. This is partially offset by increased teacher supply staff costs. Administration expenses increased slightly by $332,000, primarily due to increases for legal expenses. Student transportation reflects the impacts of the 2024-25 bus operator contract rates, higher fuel prices, and relatively stable ministry funding. Pupil accommodation expenses are projected to increase by $1.2 million, primarily due to higher utility expenses. Other, and I'm making quotation marks, other expenses have increased by $19 million. This was the same thing with the other revenue, so don't get excited. This is due to the provisions for contingencies that we are required to make by the Ministry of Education for Bill 124 remedy payments, collective agreement increases, and these are also offset by reductions in some other non-operating expenses. A few things I want to highlight as well in the expenses. As I mentioned, it does include a labor provision, specifically $13 million for the benchmark increases for outstanding negotiations. I guess they're not outstanding anymore. It reflects also an increase in supply staff costs of $1.2 million. So we will have a budget of $14.6 million. Again, this is not all funded. We have an increase in utility expenses of $800,000. We've eliminated the budget line item for board initiatives. There are no contingencies. We used to have a weather contingency. It's all gone. So that's $750,000 removed from the budget. We've reduced office supplies expenses, so share your paper clips, by $200,000. We've made a reduction in textbooks and classroom supplies of over $400,000. We've also have a reduction in administration expenses as it relates to staff development, supplies, and services of $151,000. It is important to note that there are no changes to special education programming in this budget. And that's in the $6.4 million deficit, just to clarify. As we address the current deficit challenges, it is important to understand what specific preliminary funding for 2024-25 is enveloped by the ministry. In total, $64.1 million of funding must be spent for their intended purpose and may not be used to fund any other expense category. And that is outlined on this slide for you here. When examining the funding allocations and related expenses, there are several areas where the board experiences funding deficits because the funding allocation is inadequate to support the current expense structure of the board. The ministry refers to this as a structural deficit because of how the board chooses to operate and utilize its funding, and because it's not due to a one-time event. There are 5 primary areas where individual funding deficits arise, as noted on this slide, totaling $27.8 million. Coupled with the fact that the board has $64.1 million in envelope funding, these funding gaps must be paid through unenveloped core ed funding. This requires that trustees and senior administration break down silos and identify the key priorities of the board to inform budget decisions. So how are we budgeting for strategic priorities? The preliminary 2024-25 budget proposes expenditures for justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity totaling $1.3 million, of which only $226,000 is funded by the ministry. The preliminary budget includes continuing investments in the graduation coach, Create Your Future Advisors, the Human Rights and System Equity Advisor, the Equity Teacher Consultant, the LGBTQIA+ social worker, and the Indigenous Graduation Coach. Additionally, professional learning and events for staff and students, such as the Black Joy Conference, and funds to support the student census are an important element of the strategic priority and are provided for. Administration is committed to the work identified in the Employment Systems Review and dismantling the Anti-Black Racism Report. The 2024-25 preliminary budget also continues investments in math recovery and early reading interventions, including the Math Achievement Action Plan. Student mental health and well-being will maintain investments in the well-being teachers, social workers, psychologists, applied behavior analysts, facilitators, behavior analyst, and a re-engagement counselor. As previously mentioned, funding for student mental health and well-being must be used for its intended purpose. It is enveloped. So, deficit elimination strategies. We have some options to provide to you for your consideration. The first option is that we file the 2024-25 budget as currently presented. That means we would report a $6.4 million deficit, which would represent 1.4% of the board's operating surplus. We would require the Minister of Education's approval, and we would need to file an in-year deficit elimination plan. We would draw down the accumulated surplus to a projected balance of approximately $16.2 million when we get to August 31st, 2025. We would risk, if we don't adjust anything, a full drawdown by 26-27. This option does not address the structural nature of the board's deficit. We continue as we've been going on. And the board will remain a medium to high risk board according to the Ministry of Education's parameters. And additional ministry compliance requirements are very likely in this scenario. The second option is we could file the 24-25 budget with a 1% deficit. That would mean it would be a $4.5 million deficit, but it would require further expense reductions of $1.9 million. We would still have to file the in-year deficit elimination plan. And when we get to August 31st, 2025, the operating accumulated surplus would be projected to be about $18.1 million. Again, we are still deferring the structural nature of the board's deficit. And the board would probably still remain a medium to high risk board for the ministry because we continue to report the deficit. And additional ministry requirements most likely would still be required. The third option is we file a balanced budget for 24-25. If we do that, we're looking for a further expense or an expense reduction of $6.4 million. Our accumulated surplus would be protected, and the projected balance on August 31st, 2025 would be $22.6 million. We would still need to examine the structural nature of the board's deficit to ensure that we have sustainable, fiscally responsible operations in the future. And the board's risk profile would be readdressed at that point by the ministry. So how do we do that? Administration has gone through and we have reduced non-staffing costs as much as possible. But because 80% of the board's budget is salaries and benefits, further reductions in staffing would be required, and we would specifically be looking at unfunded positions. For option 2, which is to get to 1% and looking for $1.9 million of savings, recommendations by the senior team would involve a reduction of 4.0 social workers, 2.0 FTE, speech language pathologists, 1 psychologist, 0.5 FTE communicative, disorders assistant, 6.0 student support workers, previously known as educational assistants, 2.0 outdoor education special assignment teachers, which breaks my heart, 1 teacher consultant, 0.5 secretary, 1 school support technician, and 2 NBE staff. If you wanted to proceed with option 3, we'd have to eliminate those 20 positions I just mentioned and look for another 45 full-time equivalent additional unfunded positions to get to 0. I do want to just let you know that the board is not funded for over 850 positions, affecting several staffing lines, including teachers. We have 216 FTE unfunded. Student support workers, we have 410 FTEs. Professional, paraprofessional, and technicians, there are 246. And coordinators and consultants, there are 24. Special education, international baccalaureate, and French immersion programs contribute to some of that funding disconnect. Administration's role is to provide trustees with a preliminary budget based on a set of planning assumptions, contemplation of risks, and projections for student programming, staffing, enrollment, and non-salary expenses based on the best information available at the time. Administration keeps the board's strategic mission, vision, and strategic priorities in mind when making its recommendations. Ultimately, trustees are responsible for the budget and the resulting decisions. Specifically under the Education Act, trustees are mandated to promote student achievement and well-being, deliver effective and appropriate education programs, develop, maintain, and monitor effectiveness of board policies, develop, communicate, and review annually a multi-year plan, monitor the performance of the Director of Education, and practice responsible stewardship of board resources. Administration seeks trustees' input on how to move forward with the preliminary 2024-25 budget and the 3 options presented. Depending on how trustees wish to move forward, an in-year deficit elimination plan may be required. The items noted on this slide are recommendations from administration on what actions are required to address the cost structures of the board and what should be included in the in-year deficit elimination plan. The first item would be a program review across all panels. Examples of programs that would be reviewed include French immersion, and we will be partnering with Watson and Associates on that, the International Baccalaureate Program, Special Education, PASS and ESL, Community Kitchen, Enhanced Construction, eSTEAM, Supervised Alternative Learning, International Languages, and International Students. We would also put on this in-year deficit elimination plan department reviews across the system. That would include the human resources, finance, media services, facility services, and IT departments. We would also recommend we put all unfunded positions to be reviewed for potential reduction. We will also be partnering with Watson and Associates for boundary reviews and long-term accommodation plans so that we can be looking for opportunities and recommendations to bring forward for more efficiency. And we will also be indicating competitive procurement of student transportation services for 25-26 in collaboration with Windsor-Essex Student Transportation Services. I'll wrap up this presentation with a high-level review of the preliminary 2024-25 capital budget. This is a summary of the BERS funding, I love that word, available to the board for 2024-25, including any carryover funding from prior years for use in 2024-25 school year. You will note that there is a significant decrease in the capital priorities funding due to the completion of Erie Migration District School and Beacon Heights Public School. Capital priority projects for 2024-25 include the new school in Lakeshore, additions at Northwood, Glenwood, and Roseland Public School, and also work continues at Queen Elizabeth Public School. As previously mentioned, the ministry's instructed boards to prioritize spending from school condition improvement and school renewal allocation to address facility condition, ventilation, accessibility, health and safety, and general code requirements. This slide, and I apologize it's tiny and I will send you this presentation. This slide summarizes some of the important infrastructure work that's being contemplated for 24-25. With respect to Forest Glade Public School, we will be completely rebuilding that school the best that we can using school condition improvement funding. I think the $14 million is too low, but there will be fencing, windows, exterior doors, roofing, masonry, HVAC upgrades, electrical upgrades, and we'll be infilling the school so there are proper classrooms. Harrow Public School will have washroom upgrades, interior upgrades, such as ceiling tiles, painting, flooring, infill of the open quad, HVAC upgrades, electrical upgrades, the exhaust system, and the PA system, and that's about $7.5 million. Boiler replacements from steam to hot water will be done at Queen Victoria, Prince Edward, Marlborough, and Maxwell Public Schools, approximating $4 million. There will be multiple building automation system upgrades, approximating $4 million. At Gore Hill, we will be replacing windows, exterior doors, and pavement related to play spaces, and parking lots for $1.2 million. The FDK upgrades are going to be occurring across all of our schools in the system at $1 million, and that's the outdoor space because it looks uninviting, and we want to change that image. In Colchester North, we need to remove the septic system and put a sanitary force main. So that has a TBD because it's still in the design stage, but it's expected that will cost between $7 and $8 million to do. There are many other projects that the board may be considering or administration may be considering for completion through BERS funding. Given the age of the board's infrastructure, the capital budget must remain flexible to allow administration and its consultants the ability to respond to unplanned infrastructure needs and to ensure that capital funding is available to complete the necessary work. Administration relies on engineers, cost consultants, internal resources, and the ministry's VFA program to inform capital projects that may be required each year. And my voice is dry, and I'm going to leave you with my smoochy poochie Sophie to bring some positive vibes to the group. And I'm going to go sit down, but I'm happy to answer questions along with Mr. Mayhew and anybody in the senior team.
Thank you, Superintendent Armstrong, for such an uplifting and positive presentation. So I do, before I go to the floor for questions, just want to seek some clarity from you. And from the Director of Education, and I guess Mr. Mayhew as well. Are you looking for direction this evening related to option 1, 2, and 3? Because we have a short window here before we have to make an absolute decision.
Through the chair, yes, so that we're able to move forward and put things in place to bring you the budget for the 18th. Which is only 2 weeks away in a very short period of time, like you said.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Sipkar, on that?
On that, respectfully, because we're just seeing these numbers tonight and knowing that this was coming, not realizing there was going to be options within that, what's the impact if we don't make a decision tonight and we have a proper deliberation for the next 2 weeks until the budget, because we didn't get this in advance in our package. We didn't have time to consider it, and so I don't know that I feel informed enough to really make a decision at tonight's meeting.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I completely do understand that. It's never intended to be a table drop. Literally, we were still changing this PowerPoint presentation this afternoon, and we were still deliberating as a senior team. Unfortunately, the ministry funding announcement came very late, and we're coupled with very difficult decisions here, and we tried to exhaust all alternatives first to come forward with a budget, a preliminary budget for trustees. If you need time to deliberate, that's fine. You have to understand we can't bring forward to you a budget binder with a number in it until we know the decision, or I can give you a budget binder with the $6.4 million and we're running scenarios at that time. But we also do need time to get that finalized for you, and we need to be able to make the necessary changes in EFIS to make the ministry's reporting deadline for June 28th. So there's time is a challenge, but we're happy to work with you in whatever way works best for trustees.
Okay, with that, what we'll do is we'll entertain questions of what you saw this evening, and then we'll kind of explore, and hopefully, if we can make a decision tonight, fine. If not, we may need to call a special meeting in advance of the actual budget meeting. But if it's possible to come to a decision tonight, then that's fine. I'm not pressuring anybody for that, but Trustee Burgess, I had you down for a question.
Yeah, I have several questions just for clarification, because it is a lot. It is a lot. And, every answer predicates the next one, sort of thing. So I'm looking at special education, but I have a question about the very first one, the online component, which is mandated for secondary. I heard there's a 30 to 1 ratio for online, and versus in class is 23.5 for secondary. 23.5, 22?
23 to 1.
23 to 1. Okay, sorry. 23 to 1. Okay. And I'm concerned in that I want to know the logistics of it, because it seems like we're looking at special education funding, support staff, all kinds of things. Those 7 more kids in the class, if they have special education needs, is there a compensation for that from the ministry? Because that I see as like an intersectionality that isn't really pleasant. So if we have even a larger class, and that means there are kids in that class, just by stats, have more special education needs, how are they going to be met?
Through you, Chair. There is no consideration for students who are identified with special education needs. It is strictly 30 to 1, and that 32% of our students should be taking an online course during this budget year. Whether they are or aren't, that's how we're funded.
Okay, we're going to go around the table. Trustee Buckler.
I wasn't happy with what I saw in option 2, because we're already waiting for speech pathologists. I know that for a fact. And the other positions you were looking at cutting were just too important. And 3, I don't know where we can find 16 million in savings, or 6 million in savings in 2 weeks. But I really would love to engage in Watson research of our IB, of how we're doing our programming. If we can do it more efficiently, then that's great. But options 2 and 3 just were not there for me. Thank you.
Trustee Nelson.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I had some concerns around the special education piece too, especially when we have a waiting list. If we were to choose to trim down the budget more, how do we then, have we reimagined what that would look like for our special education and those in need of that special education support? Or would that come after we make a decision?
Through you, Chair, I'll start with it, and Superintendent Armstrong or Mr. Mayhew, you can add in. I think it needs to be really clear that those positions that we have recommended are unfunded. We receive zero funding for that. We are one of very few boards across the province who have the luxury of having those positions. There are community agents who are funded for those. And I spent my career in special education. I absolutely appreciate the challenge of waiting lists. However, we receive zero funding for some of those positions that were outlined. The community partners receive funding. The unfortunate part is they don't receive enough either.
Are there any other questions, Trustee Sipkar? Yep.
Through you, Mr. Chair, almost called you Madam Chair. My question, this is the first year that trustees have been presented with options since I've been a trustee for the last several years, and I mean, even beyond that, I believe. And I really appreciate the level of transparency and, about what those options would entail, where the different envelopes are going. It was a very comprehensive presentation. What was the intention with bringing forward options? In that, are they ranked hierarchically? So option one is the preference of administration, or are they just saying, here's what we could do under various, is it almost like scenarios? And I guess what I'm trying to ask really is, what would be admin's position? Is it evident within those numbers or those options, or are you really saying, we're not sure? Trustees, we're kind of, hitting the ball into your court kind of a thing.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate, because I've been here for a while, that there wasn't options. The senior team did discuss it at length about what we wanted to do. I'll be quite frank, we couldn't come to a balanced budget without drastic measures. And I don't believe that lies completely on senior administration to make those decisions, since it's the board's responsibility, capital B, to approve the budget. So in an effort of transparency, we wanted to provide, because there's ramifications of going to the 2%, which has been outlined by Superintendent Armstrong very clearly with the ministry. There's ramifications for a 1%, and then there's the balanced budget, which is what, of course, would be expected. So we wanted to be very clear of, here are 3 options, and here's what they would have to look like. We'll do the work of getting to where we need to get to, but thought that trustees needed to be prepared. If we would have come forward with a balanced budget, I can assure you what we would have heard, because we heard clapping around special education as an example, when we have a $10 million deficit in that area. If we made changes in that area, that would solve our entire problem. And I'm not saying to do that, but we want to be transparent about where the pressures are.
I'll come back. Okay. Trustee Chin?
Oh, thank you, Chair. And my question is that I'm not quite understanding the funding for the indigenous. Let's package the budget, and it's over 1 million. And previously we mentioned 1.3 or 6 million for the EDI. What's the relationship there? I'm kind of confused. And thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Indigenous funding, we did speak about at the last board meeting, is separately enveloped and must be spent on Indigenous. The EDI is separate.
So when we mention the 1.6 million EDI, does it include that Indigenous enveloped funding?
Mr. Chair, no, it does not.
Trustee McKinley?
Thank you, Chair. Not question as much as just a comment. This is probably the most bothersome budget I've experienced since 2007. and that was not a good year either. It was my first year as a trustee, and that budget process was also very painful. As trustees, we worked and we closed schools. We did some ugly work to develop that operating surplus that we have. And I would just prefer to use up every last dime that we've got from our operating surplus. And then if we have to make tougher choices, then we'll have to make tougher choices, or hopefully the government gets a clue and figures out that they're not funding our student amount according to OPSPA and I believe code. I've seen twice a number of $776 in addition that we should, if the province was going to keep up with the inflation rate, receive, and if we received from the province even 700 of the 776 calculated additional dollars at 35,000 students, the math comes up to $24.5 million that we wouldn't be facing these decisions about cuts to anything in our board. And that's a sad day that with inflation and everybody else having to pay more, there's this not getting an equal amount of increase for our students for all of our expenses, and that's not right. So I'm all in on using up our operating surplus and dealing with the cuts after we've used it up, because I don't want the government getting any of it.
Okay, trustee, I don't know that you have to answer that. Yeah. Trustee Sipcar, you have another question? Okay. Trustee Armstrong.
Well, thank you, Trustee McKinley. I was thinking along the same lines. I just have a question about terminology. You talked about, for Harrow Public School, infill of open quad. What does that mean, please?
I might look to Superintendent Onlander, who probably knows the school better, but what we're doing is we're closing in the open spaces, so it's not an open classroom setting for schools, but we're making proper walls, so it's an enclosed learning space.
I have a couple questions, but I'm going to save mine to the end. Did you have any other questions, Trustee Burgess? Go ahead.
Again, for clarification, thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you, if I could, Superintendent, you mentioned aging infrastructure and even with new schools, the old ones keep getting older. So we don't seem to really kind of make that leap. But we are closing several schools. So I'm wondering if that snapshot for what the latent repairs were going to be for this next year, do they still include like KPS and KDHS and Jack Miner and yeah. So is there any amount in that's the capital part, I understand, but is there any amount in there that you can tell us what's going to drop off?
Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. I don't have that data directly in front of me, but I can certainly follow up.
Can I ask another one? Okay. There's the elimination of funding to support de-streaming, and that was $1.9 million. And that's been a difficult thing to do. It's been a difficult thing to do, and still maintain, achievement. So what's the plans if we eliminate it? How are we going to support de-streaming?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Ideally, we would support it by having a little bit more money because we had a plan, temporary plan in place for next year to put some, use the coaching model that we have that's already working in secondary with our special assignment teachers for literacy. With the budget deficit, that's probably not going to happen now for as a pilot project. But in terms of supporting de-streaming, one of the we already have our SALTs, or our special assignment teachers, our special assignment literacy teachers. They are very effective in working with teachers in the classroom, co-teaching, co-planning, etc. There's not a requirement that that teachers of D-stream classes choose to work with the SALTs, but that's going to be, we do have several that are in grade 9, and we will be continuing to support or to encourage principals to sort of tap their D-stream teachers to be part of the learning with the SALTs at the school level. So this is learning that's done in the school, where the coach comes in and works directly with the teachers, does some sessions with them together, but then also spends time working with them in their particular classrooms. And so we're hoping to shift some of the focus to D-stream classes more so, or teachers of D-stream classes more so than some of our other teachers. So that's one way that we're supporting it. We also have some, we'll call them sort of one-off sessions that we're doing with teachers. Like we've had some sessions happening at the end of this year for teachers of D-stream geography, teachers of D-stream math, and it's our same team of coaches that is working with them specifically in the curriculum, in their curriculum area. So we're using the limited dollars that we have and the structures that we have in place that are working to try to shift the support a little bit more to our classes, D-stream classes.
If I could supplemental to that, well, I mean, that sounds great because it reminds me of the arts thing. You work with the teachers to, professionally development on during the day, and mentor and support. That sounds good. I mean, that's a great model. I just want to register a concern about that if it's not mandatory. If somebody can say, no, I'm not going to work with that SALT. I'm not going to work with that. No, I'm not. And they have a right to if it's not part of their job description, I suppose. But if it's something like an elimination of almost $2 million of something that was working because that's the project that, the program that we kind of developed, then it seems to me that there's still a risk there for achievement. Immediate achievement, so that's a red flag to me. I also want to make a comment, and every year we do the budget. Every year we send a letter saying this is terrible. You're really underfunded. But I want to note that it's like, how much was the EICPP? It was like between $5 and $6 million. Yeah. So what would we do with the $5.6 million? That's nobody's fault. It's a federal thing imposed, and it's just not being recognized. This is a political decision we're making, and we're carrying other jurisdictions of government that are not letting the money flow when it's a mandatory thing for us. I would love to have that $5.6 million. Thank you. So just put that on the list, please, for the letter, that is eventually going to be there, because whatever option we choose, and option number 1 is the only one, and I practically need a respirator, to plug my nose and approve that. I mean, but that's ridiculous when we have something as obvious as that. I have a question about the elimination of safe and clean schools funding, because I'm not sure exactly what that included, if that included that federal money that flowed through no, it didn't. Okay. I want some sort of, I know the temperature adjustment, I understand that, the thermal thing, but please tell me that HVAC is going to continue during cold, flu, and COVID season with increased MRV and the same air exchange. We're not cutting that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, no changes to that. We are simply adjusting the temperature in order to utilize less utilities. But it's important to note, with the elimination of those funding supports, the cost of running those ventilation systems longer and the cost of the MRV filters and the electricity and the utilities is still a burden that is borne by school boards.
I totally get that. Last thing, if I could, very last.
Okay.
Very last.
I have student trustee as well, but
Very
go ahead. We'll get it done, and then
I was trying to see what the elimination of the 40 positions, et cetera, and who was what. The mindfulness, self-regulation person we have, do we still have that program? Because that really was paying huge dividends as far as self-regulation, and that's just an investment in good classroom management and achievement. So I don't want to get rid of that. And I didn't see that listed. Did I miss something? Is that still going?
Thank you through you, Mr. Chair. God bless, I was going to do it too. Um,
I am the only guy here. I pointed
that,
that out
yeah,
earlier.
I know. That position would currently be funded through the Student Mental Health and Wellbeing Grant, which is enveloped. Depending on, again, there's opportunities in terms of how we would utilize that funding. So for now, there would be no intention to eliminate that position, but things always are in flux and potentially could change.
And I do want to apologize to Student Trustee Pine. I forgot you were here earlier in the private session. I made a comment about being the only guy, but thank you for being here in public session to support me. Go ahead.
Thank you through you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to start with thank you so much to the team who worked on this budget. We all knew going into it, it was going to be like getting blood from a stone. And you worked really hard to even bring us a slight reduction in the deficit that we are facing. So that's amazing. I was just wondering, because I know it was listed about how much special education costs us per year, but is there a breakdown of the other programs like IB and the other ones that were listed where we can see how much it's costing us, just to kind of get an aspect on that?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, when administration we've deliberated over numerous director council meetings. We've reviewed data related to that, so certainly that is information that we can share and provide. And that helped inform some of the budget decisions or recommendations that we've already reflected in the $6.4 million. The in-year deficit elimination plan recommendations to include program review would be far more in depth, because really at the end of the day, if the board, capital B, chooses not to act on this, the ministry will come in and will make those decisions. Whether it's 1 year or 2 years, there won't be any money left. So that I can't see that not happening if there's no action taken, but we certainly can share some of that information to assist.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask a couple questions myself. So you mentioned that sick leave, $14.6 million. Am I correct in assuming that the negotiations related to sick time credits is something that's not in our control?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, they are not. Those are items that are negotiated and bargained centrally by the province.
So if the central bargaining team had, say, cut by 50% the credits that are available to be used, that would have eliminated our entire $6 million deficit, $6.4 million deficit, which I understand is a bare bones kind of thing. If we were able to get that down, cut it in half through centrally bargaining, we would essentially eliminate our deficit.
Through you, Mr. Chair, potentially, I would say, because of some of the significant changes in the illnesses that we are seeing. Hard to predict, but yes, because it continues, so does the absence continues because of access to it.
Yeah, so I guess my point is that 14.6 is something that's completely out of our control. Significantly out of our control. So the other thing I wanted to ask, so $6.4 million projected deficit in option 1, and 35,600 students is a rounded number. Would I be correct in assuming that we're $179.77 short per student to cover that $6 million? Would you agree with me? I did the math. Okay, thank you. So I guess my point is that I believe our students are worth $179.77 more each than what the government's giving us. And that doesn't even come remotely close to what Trustee McKinley talked about earlier about the $770. So I think our students are worth $179.77. So those are my questions. I think what we need to do now is we need to consider two things. One is, are we, so we have three options. Option three is significantly difficult. It's certainly a scorched earth approach, in my opinion. Option two, and I'm working my way backwards. Option two, we'll see some reductions that were outlined by the superintendent, but it brings our deficit down to 4 million. It brings us within that 1% and puts us into a situation where we're going to see less oversight. Or option one, which is the $6.4 million deficit, knowing that there's significant risk that the province may say, you guys are not doing your job and we're going to take over. Am I correct in that? Okay. So I just want to make sure that everybody that's sitting at the table around here right now is aware that if we select option one, there's a good chance we will be relinquishing our control of this board. That's a significant possibility. Yep. I'm throwing that out, kind of kick off the debate in terms of where we're going. Trustee Sipkar had her hand up first, so I'll go with her.
I'd like to make a motion at the appropriate time, so I'll let Trustee Burgess go and then.
My understanding was number two we would still be medium to high risk in the eyes of the ministry, so they would just as likely come in on number two.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the current monitoring that we're under by the ministry is the lowest level, which is simply just quarterly reporting. Coming in at the 1%, we would not need to get the Minister of Education's approval. Correct, option two. How the ministry will react, I'm not 100% positive. They're going to take a look at a number of factors. They're going to take a look at our accumulated surplus. They're going to look at our cash balances. They're going to look at the items listed in the in-year deficit elimination plan to see if there is an intent or a desire to make changes to adjust cost structures. They're going to factor all of those elements in. It may result in the same level of reporting. It won't eliminate it. It may level in the same amount of reporting. They could send somebody in here to do an audit, to guide us in making decisions, as opposed to full-out ministry supervision. I doubt you would see that in 24, 25, because there's still accumulated surplus that's available, correct? If you took option two. If you took option one, if you choose to go with the 6.4 million, the level of compliance reporting that we'll have to do will be greater. I suspect they could send somebody in, but it might not necessarily be supervision yet, because there still is accumulated surplus. But again, they're going to look at all those factors, and is there the intent and the willingness to truly adjust the cost structures? Because they're going to look to us, to the board, to deal with that first, as opposed to the funding. We've seen where this has landed over and over with letters. It's crickets. It doesn't get you what you're looking for.
So supplemental, if I could, just on the surplus, that none of these options use the accumulated surplus. Now we've eliminated contingency things, but so that's our only contingency is the accumulated surplus. Is there a reason why using any of that wasn't included in any option?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. Options 1 and 2, which is a $6.4 million deficit, or going to 1%, which is a $4.5 million deficit, reduce the operating surplus. It uses it. Balancing the budget keeps it at zero. The only risk, and I mentioned this before, litigation, settlements, um, administration or facility services, repairs, they have to get funded from something. And that is the only option that we have available for those items in most cases.
Trustee McKinley.
Yeah, I'd just like to state, we get a lot of articles sent to us, and we are not the only board with this problem. There's a whole lot of them. I dare say the province would have a hard time sending out enough people to take over enough boards all at the same time with the current status. That doesn't mean that they couldn't come, but currently we have an operating surplus. So I don't think they're coming down to take over until such a time as we've used because I'm pretty sure there's other boards that don't have operating surpluses at all that have budget deficits that they would also need to see.
So for clarity, I didn't say they are coming down. I said we're at risk of that happening.
But I'll take that risk.
Okay.
For our
No,
students,
and I'm throwing it out there. That's your opinion, right?
Yep.
And
I get that.
I get that. Trustee Armstrong.
Just for clarification, we got that surplus through the sale of existing buildings, right? No, oh, we didn't. Okay. I was going to ask what happens to the funds when the properties that are up for sale are sold. Am I right in thinking that we don't get to keep that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, when the board sells a property, the proceeds of disposition, yes, the board does get to keep, but according to the Education Act, it can only be used towards capital related projects, and you require the Ministry of Education's permission in order to utilize it. So for example, when we had a large deficit, well, not a deficit, when we had funding challenges with Erie Migration District School, I'll get used to the name, we applied for additional funding from the ministry for that project, but they also required us to utilize the proceeds of disposition that we had received from prior property dispositions as part of the funding to make up that gap. So it's not available for operating purposes.
So for clarity, Trustee Armstrong, that accumulated surplus it's from us being fiscally responsible over the course of the years and being able to squirrel little bits of money away over the course of a number of years. Right, operating money. So where we were fortunate enough, for example, when interest rates were lower, we were doing much better than when interest rates were higher, right? So we were able to squirrel some money away. And obviously inflation also is an impact on that, right? Okay. Trustee Sipkar?
I would like to make a motion out of this presentation, and if I get a seconder, I'll speak to it with the rationale. I'd like for the board to call a special meeting of the board in 1 week's time to deliberate on the three options after we receive this information in a written report. And if I get a seconder, I'll speak to my rationale.
The seconder, Trustee Jean. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I fully appreciate the complexity and difficulty in putting this together and how last minute it was with the government. I still feel that as one of the three pillars of the role of trustee is approving the budget, and the first time that we've really been giving significant options with respect to significant cuts. This is an unprecedented budget, so to speak. I feel grossly unprepared because I can't even see the numbers in front of me. Not to put Trustee Burgess on the spot, but she didn't realize that we were even using some of our surplus. I think that this is too critical of a decision to give direction on without having, at the very least, a written report in front of us. With that said, I also recognize that there are two trustees who are not here tonight. Had they seen this on the agenda, I'm not saying that it would have changed their decision or impacted their plans, but I know that myself would have been motivated differently if I, knew about it. So I want to give them the benefit of the doubt or the opportunity. And so while we all may have leanings about what we feel comfortable with or, what our risk appetite is currently, I think having a sober second thought in the sense that we have the time to deliberate on it for a few days, speak to our colleagues, get a sense of the temperature, ask questions to administration would put us in a much better position to actually make an informed decision. So I would like to make that motion. Or I guess I already have, so I would
Yeah,
like
you've
to.
made that
Yeah.
motion and seconded. You've spoken to it now. Does anybody else wish to speak to that motion? I would like to make a quick comment because you've put it for 1 week's time. I'm out of town the 10th, 11th, and 12th. So if I'm going to chair the meeting, it would have to be the 13th, which is a Thursday. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we missed graduations last year because of a special.
I could make a friendly amendment to say ahead of the next scheduled board meeting in the interim at a date to be determined by the board. I think the point is that we get a chance to speak to it, and even at that point, you might have the ability to phone in or something.
Okay, trustee. Okay, does anybody else wish to speak to this? If not, I'm going to call the question. All in support of deferring for a week or so, as presented by the mover. All in support of delaying for one week or so. Put your hand up, please. All in support. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 5. It's defeated because. Oh, that's right. Sorry. Thank you. So it passes. Sorry. Yeah. 5/8. Correct. I'm so used to the 10, right? Okay. So that's where we're at. So we're going to have a meeting next week, and it's a budget meeting. So you may have to make alternate arrangements if you want to attend, if you have a graduation. Anyways, we'll see what we can do. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry.
Fair enough.
I'm wondering if it could be at a time when
Yeah,
work schedules and or before any
I will
graduation.
confer.
Because I got told this year that I didn't go to a graduation last year because I didn't want to.
Yeah. I will confer
Which is
with the
not true.
chair and the director of education and the superintendent of finance, and we'll come up with a proposed date and time that may be of assistance. Okay, so I'm sorry, Superintendent Armstrong, you're going to have to wait. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. There are no delegations, no one on the speakers list, no new business. We have 2 reports that are attachments. Is there anything that you wish to say? Are there any questions on either K1 or K2? Go ahead.
I'll just keep it quick through you, Mr. Chair. I appreciated the operations update K2, and I think that added a level of transparency about all the projects that are ongoing right now. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. That's all.
Okay, any other questions on K1 or K2? Trustee McKinley?
Yeah, there was just one. As I was looking at on page 11, Northwood Public School under the existing facility partnerships, it says in red, program closed in February 2024. I guess I was curious. My curious mind was wondering why'd the program close?
Are you referring to the child care? So there was, with respect to the child care, there was circumstances with the numbers of students attending the child care that could not be met. And in consultation with the child care provider, they put out a survey, and there was not representation of the families who wanted to attend the child care. Thus, they could not proceed with offering it at that location.
Trustee Burgess?
So this was existing facility partnerships in schools for 23-24, with the options that we were given, increased rental costs, et cetera, were part of an assumption. Is that going to, do you think, affect any of these community partnerships?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the budget presentation for 24-25 is contemplating increased rental revenues. We are not able to make any changes to childcare rental rates because the ministry is in the process of reviewing their funding formula. For anything that is a new build, a new childcare build using capital priority funding, then we are required to recover cost recovery for those childcare scenarios. But for the majority of these, the board actually is nowhere near cost recovery in terms of the rates that's being charged. And we cannot address that at this time based on the ministry direction.
So the new spaces at Erie Migration.
That would be on a cost recovery basis.
Thank you.
Okay, Trustee Chin.
My question is that this report has two criteria for availability, and it has to be operating at 60% or less of on-the-ground capacity, or a school has 200 or more unused pupil places. And I think it's not consistent with the partners we list after that, because some of the partners they used after school, and then I'm just confused. I wonder if we can, rent our facilities out after school, and but that is not consistent with these criteria.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. This criteria that's listed on this report is outlined in the Education Act. And what it requires is when the board has a scenario where a school has not been operating or has been only operating at 60% capacity, on their ground capacity, or has 200 or more unused pupil places, we are required to have an annual meeting with community partners to see if anyone is interested in utilizing that excess space. However, the board regularly rents its facilities after variety of after-school programs to community clubs. It involves the use of gyms, library spaces. It involves the use of fields. And we do make our spaces available, as you can see, through childcare partners before and after school clubs, the YMCA clubs. And then we have community partnerships like the Essex Aquatic Center. We have the elite training systems at Kennedy Collegiate Institute. So we do utilize our spaces in that way with the community, but to have the community partner meeting and to use excess classroom space for a partnership, you have to meet those two criteria.
Okay, we're going to move on to trustee question period. Are there any questions? Any questions? Trustee Chin, do you have a question?
I'm sorry. I'm not respectful. I'm not going to offend anybody, and I just don't quite understand. We have a lot of budget, shortage, and why we don't consider the cut in the EDI part, because based on the previous survey in the questionnaire, I see many people complained regarding the money spent on this part, and why I think in our meeting we even don't consider any cut on that, and I don't know compared with previous years, and how about the budget is keeping the same, or is actually more than before. I'm just curious about that. Why we don't consider that? Because we have a lot of, respondents mentioning that.
So, Trustee Chin, on that, 2 points. One is that there is a section under the Education Act that requires EDI be addressed. So we have to have dollars that stand behind the programming that we've already identified. That was kind of answered earlier this evening. The second point is we just agreed to have a budget discussion at some point next week. So we'll be looking at all aspects of the budget at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? Trustee Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question was asked from a recent, very well-attended, successful school closing ceremony, always bittersweet. And the question was, where will the memorabilia from the school, I got part of the answer, but I really want some firm answer. Where does the buck stop? Who actually makes the final decision, which consultation of what memorabilia gets kept, archived, gifted back to whomever maybe had some sort of, affiliation with it, what gets trashed, what gets displayed in the new school. We have Jack Miner, Kingsville Public, Kingsville District High School. It was from a Kingsville District High School alumnus that was very interested in knowing where that is going to go and if they could get their old awards back or if they're going to be trashed. So.
Who can answer that for me?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So that work is done through my office. If people have questions, they're more than welcome to contact Scott Scantlebury.
So supplemental they did, and the answer was, well, that will be determined, but it's determined by somebody, but we didn't know who got the final, who does the final, like that's the one that stays in the new building, and these are the ones that are remaining.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I guess it depends on what it is. If somebody wants something, they're more than welcome to call and ask for it. If it's available to them, because we may be wanting to keep it, not necessarily for the new school, but for something else, then those decisions are made. And to be frank, sometimes it's garbage and it does go in the garbage.
Okay, so moving on to notices of motion. Any notices of motion? No notices of motion. Announcements. Trustee Sipkar.
Thank you. Our one announcement for this evening, June is Bike Month. So with the summer weather starting in full force now, it's a great time to get outside and be on your bike. I'd like to give a shout out to James L. Dunn, who did their first ever slow roll, riding around the neighborhood. This was technically not in June, but it was a nice setup for June, as it really, I think, got a lot of families out. I've noticed the bike rack is full almost every morning. So it's important to learn about bike safety, and we thank a number of our partners, community partners who have assisted us on our active transportation task force as well. And so if there's any information that they're interested in for for Bike Month in particular, they can visit the City of Windsor's website as well.
Does anybody else have any announcements? I have one. I don't know if anybody's heard this yet or not, but June 3rd through 7th is Crossing Guard Appreciation Week. This is a great time to show our gratitude for all the wonderful crossing guards who help keep our community and our children safe. The City of Windsor has thank you cards and coloring sheets available at the City of Windsor's website under Crossing Guards. So if anybody's children want to make a card up and celebrate our crossing guards, they can do so. Any other announcements? Seeing there's no other announcements, we are going to adjourn and convene into the public meeting.
Thank you. We're now have reconvened into our public meeting. Thank you, Operations and Finance, as well as the Education Committee. Thank you very much. Do we have any, first of all, the attendance is unchanged from our last, our Ops and Finance. Is there any declarations of conflict of interest? Seeing none. Actions of the board meeting private session. Trustee Sipkar?
Sure. There was item F1, which is an item on negotiations, and item G3, which is a personnel item.
Thank you.
I'll move both and then, yeah.
Okay. Okay, we have a mover, we seconder, trustee Leclerc, all in support. And that passes. Thank you very much. Any business arising from the minutes? Oh, sorry, excuse me. Approval of the minutes from the public board meeting of May the 6th. Trustee Leclerc, seconded by trustee McKinley, all in support. Thank you. Any business arising from the minutes? No business arising from the minutes. Any recommendations from the Education Committee? Trustee McKinley? None from Education, Operations and Finance Committee. Trustee Leclerc?
Yeah, I'd move item G1, which is a deferral of the budget discussions until next week sometime.
Thank you. Moving on now to notices of motion. Any notices of motion? Okay. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a blessed night, and we'll see you next meeting.